Okay, great. Thanks so much, everyone, for staying with us here in the Central and West Bayonne breakout room. Once again, my name is Kevin. I will be starting out our breakout here. I'd also like to introduce Mary.
Hi, everyone. Mary Kimball from the Arcadis team. I'll be presenting some of the recommendations on the policy and governance side of things.
Thank you, Mary. And we also have Greg.
Hey everyone, I'm Greg Lemaire. I'm an urban designer at One Architecture, and I will be taking us through the physical solutions today.
Thank you so much, Greg. So I'll just once again go over briefly some guidelines for the meeting, then give a brief introduction, talk a little bit about the context of the breakout room, the central and west portions of Bayonne that we'll be talking about. And then we're going to be excited to share some potential solutions with you. So just briefly, we have some material to present, but we also want this to be a conversation. We want to have a discussion and we want to hear from you. So there will definitely be some times where we're going to open it up for discussion. If at any time when we're presenting, if you have any questions or thoughts that you'd like to share, please use the chat function and share with us. We'd love to hear from you. When it does come time for more of a discussion, please indicate that you'd like to speak by either using the raise hand icon or let us know in the chat box. If you'd be willing to, if you're comfortable, please consider turning your camera on. We'd love to see you, but if not, that's okay. And just keep in mind that everyone needs a chance to speak. If you find that you're talking, a long time, please consider stepping back and giving someone else a chance. But we love to hear from everyone's voice and perspective. So a little overview of what we're going to share in this breakout room. We're going to talk about what is important and what is at risk in the Central and West Bayonne neighborhoods. We're going to present three potential solution scenarios. And for each one, we're going to show possible actions that can be taken, how the area might change as a result of those actions, key considerations for each, and then we're going to have a little bit of open discussion. We want to hear what you think about what we've presented. We want to talk about of what we have shown you, what we discuss. What do you think is the most important to advance? What do you like the most? What do you think is going to be most effective? Or what do you not want to happen? What do you think would have too much of a detrimental impact on the community or might not be effective? I'm just going to say this quote again because I really love it here. We have the tools and ideas like a carpenter, but this is your house. We really want this plan to be crafted by you. So we'd love to hear from everyone, and we're so glad that you're here to participate with us. So we're going to go into the a little description of the area, and please feel free to share with us if you think that this geographic breakdown makes sense for discussion purposes, or if you think we should consider breaking down neighborhoods differently. So for the central and western portion of Bayonne, we are talking about mostly the areas that are west and north of Route 440. This is also west and north of the Hudson-Bergen light rail line. And this is really the more established residential and commercial area of Bayonne. It's characterized by mostly residential areas. We have some main corridors, including the John F. Kennedy Boulevard corridor, Avenue C, the Broadway commercial area, and the western border is along Newark Bay. And we have a lot of Bayonne's beautiful parks right along the waterfront. That's something that we've heard from our previous outreach, that people really, love the access to the parks. There is a desire, in certain portions of the city to see more green space and trees and green infrastructure. And Bayonne is a little bit more, in some ways, car oriented than some of the other Hudson County communities. But we do hear that pedestrian experience and access to public transportation is important for everyone. So we'll talk a little bit about the risk context of this area. So the area is susceptible to flooding from both rainfall flooding as well as coastal flooding coming from coastal storms and storm surge combined with rising tides. So we had mentioned briefly in the opening presentation that we're utilizing some modeling to take a look at the potential future impacts of climate change and how our storms could get worse. So on the map here, you can see we're looking at two different types of flooding. In the sort of bluish, purplish color, you can see inside the boundaries of the neighborhood, a lot of streets are susceptible to flooding. And we've heard that this happens even right now. There was someone in our last meeting session who mentioned a particular intersection that always floods. We've heard about some low-lying areas under overpasses that flood frequently during storm events, and the city is already taking some action to alleviate some of that. But the model here shows in 2070 incorporating high tides and a potential of 10% rainfall increase. And you can see that a lot of the roadway corridors, could potentially be flooded if no other action is taken. And we'll also mention the storm surge, which would be really sort of coastal or tidal flooding. In sort of the orange color, you can see a predicted potential 2070 storm extent for an event that would be similar to Hurricane Sandy, also factoring in sea level rise. So you can see that in some portions of the city, some low-lying portions, there are some pretty substantial areas that could be flooded, but in the particular central and west Bayonne neighborhood that we're talking about, it is limited mostly to the parks that are right along the waterfront. So before we get any further, I just want to open it up and ask what everybody thinks about what we've shown so far. Are we missing anything that's important about this community? And are there any potential flood risks or areas of risk that we may not have identified or that we particularly want to pay attention to? Okay, I think we will keep going with our presentation, but please let us know in the chat if you have any thaws, and there will be more opportunities for discussion as we go on. We're excited to show you some potential actions that we can take. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Greg to go through our scenarios and potential actions.
Great, thanks, Kevin. So now we'll be walking through each scenario in our focus area. We'll be talking about its physical actions, non-physical solutions, and some key changes that may result. So first, a quick overview of our scenario groupings. In such a dense and complicated region, such as Northeastern New Jersey, our scenarios are grouped by the actors and possible implementation pathways for our actions. So in scenario 1, individual initiative, individual entities are the drivers of change under the purview of the city. Agencies, individuals, and institutions will all act to create resilience in their own ways, adding up to a cumulative resilience building. In scenario 2, shared responsibility, we more explicitly bring in the private actors and institutions to work hand in hand with the city through partnerships to build a collective resilience by opening up more opportunities, funding, and overall increasing the potential footprint and impact of the measures. And lastly, in scenario 3, regional coordination, all entities work together under the guidance of a regional resilience organization. Again, increasing the impact and effectiveness of resilience measures while weaving in other co-benefits like regional connectivity, ecology, and economies. Now, before we dive in, just a reminder that we're here to hear from you today. So at the end of each scenario run through, we'll pause to get your feedback, what you like or dislike about what we just presented and how it will impact you. Don't be afraid to let us know your thoughts, and please feel free to add thoughts and questions to the chat throughout, or raise your hand and chime in if you see something that you feel strongly about in the moment.
And while we're here, Greg, I'm just going to switch to the translators.
Perfect.
Hacer un cambio de intérprete.
Okay, we should be good.
Okay. So let's dive in. As we just laid out, today's focus area of West and Central Bayonne is mainly at risk from rainfall flooding, but we also see some coastal flooding both from extreme storms and some potential daily tidal inundation by the year 2070. These mainly affect the parks on Newark Bay, so we'll be looking at some solutions for that. So looking at individual actions and what individual entities can do, the city is already doing a lot on its own, partially through the LTCP and partially through projects that you have heard about like Fitzpatrick Park and the underground retention. So keeping that in mind, scenario 1 works with the LTCP and proposed projects for increasing the drainage via the LTCP project. For example, if we're looking at the drainage in the more central area of the city going out towards the bay, we would propose sort of a dig once approach, where if the LTCP is already increasing capacity there, we propose creating a more robust system, separating sewers, creating retention areas that would just be for stormwater, etc., working within the current confines of how the city works. This would also mean, though, that the individual park spaces also owned by the city outside of Stephen R. Gregg Park to the north would be responsible for protecting their own key assets. So individual buildings, fields, service buildings, etc., would all be individually protected. Along with this, we see that the city already has a robust green infrastructure program, which we would keep building upon on some key corridors throughout the city that you can see in the green lines on this map here. The main corridors that we are looking at through the city here are Avenue C and JFK and Avenue A mixture. These corridors would not necessarily be a full stretch of green infrastructure, but we see these as some of the main opportunities on wider streets, et cetera, where right-of-way green infrastructure can be introduced and help more localized flooding. So what does all of this mean when it hits the ground? Within this slide, we're showing a few examples of how this could manifest when it actually comes to implementation and on individual properties. So for example, within coastal protections, we see some examples of how individual sites and buildings can be protected. Now, this would be in conjunction with the city in a way that the city can provide guidance, can provide connection to funding sources, etc. It doesn't mean that everyone is going it alone completely. Normal funding sources and opportunities would still be involved in scenario one. For drainage improvements, we can see some examples of how to use existing parks, which fits within our context, to both improve stormwater surface conveyance, but also, like we see in Fitzpatrick Park, which is already almost completed, some subsurface stormwater detention. This can fully be integrated into park spaces, et cetera, without disturbing the park space above and hold hundreds of gallons of water from the system. One of the last examples is green infrastructure. This is something that Carly started to talk about a bit earlier. We have a very impervious area. There is a lot of pavement, parking lots, etc. So working within the city's current system, if you look to this thumbnail to the left here, these pink spaces spread throughout the city are all city-owned impervious spaces. Again, parking lots, larger fields, other areas that water cannot penetrate. So transforming a lot of these to permeable spaces will help absorb the water locally and take that out of the system. Similarly with right-of-way green infrastructure, which I just discussed along those corridors. So now when we're thinking of how to weigh these options, we have this slide breaking down some objectives broken out by action type. The key considerations that we might look into, such as construction time, cost, permitting, and at the bottom, level of protection. And then lastly, issues to consider. What are the trade-offs here? What should we consider when weighing this scenario against another? What should we consider for its impact on our daily life? So for example, coastal protections, we're just looking at some individual, mainly park protections here. But the trade-off and potential issue here is that we are only looking at those spaces. The parks will still flood, some of the buildings may not. There will still be some recovery time from extreme events. Within drainage improvements, we're looking at improving the existing system in latching onto existing projects in order to improve them, make them more robust. Though this is easier to do in scenario one, also cheaper to do if we are using the dig once approach, the benefits are generally limited if we are working within the confines of the current system, and it may result in the overwhelming of some of the treatment systems that currently exist. Lastly, for green infrastructure, we would be primarily targeting, like I said, the public properties, but that will also compete with the other needs on public properties, other needs in the right-of-way, etc. And now I will turn it over to Mary to discuss some of the non-physical solutions for scenario one.
Thanks, Greg. So in addition to those physical strategies, all of the scenarios include a range of more non-physical solutions. So things like policies and programs or governance to really complement those physical strategies as well as implement some of them. So in scenario one, we're focused on, actions at the individual level, individual property owners, individual residents, as well as the municipality acting on its own. So some of the examples from the non-physical solutions for scenario one include a city-led flood management 101 campaign. So this would include materials to increase awareness about flooding, as well as guidelines about what property owners could do to make their own properties more resilient. Another option would be to, as Greg was mentioning, all of the municipal properties that are opportunities for incorporating green infrastructure, to really have a policy that would require green infrastructure as new municipal properties or as municipal properties are developed, as well as developing a municipal stormwater utility, which could be used to, to set additional standards for privately owned sites. So with all of these scenarios, sorry, the background noise, we're looking for input on, some specific questions, and we'll come back to some of these questions on all of the scenarios about, which are specific streets or specific city properties that you would want to see transformed. Are there greening projects that appeal to you the most? And then the resilience hub idea that we mentioned, what would be a good location for those resilience hub to be located? But also want to hear specific feedback about the scenarios themselves. What do you like about what you heard in scenario one? Are there things that you dislike? What are sort of things that are rising to the top in terms of priorities for you? I see a hand up from Ahmed.
Yep.
Yeah, hi. I was gonna say in regards to the resilience hubs, I think the high school, Bayonne High School, would probably be a good spot to do, especially near the ice rink, because I know that they've used it before for what's it called, like a food pantry, as well as I think they did something with the vaccinations as well. So I think it's like an area that the public knows well, that communities could kind of flood into when it comes to something like that.
Great idea. Sorry, I had to give my dog a treat. So he would be quiet. Any other reactions?
Thanks so much, Ahmed, for sharing the idea about the resiliency hub. I'd like to mention a thought in terms of policy based on the examples that Mary had shared. I really love the idea of a requirement for developments, including those done by the city, to incorporate some green infrastructure. We have just seen within the past couple of years the NJDEP adopt some new requirements for green infrastructure in new developments. And I think it's going to be a great thing across the state. In all of our urban communities, we do see a lot of this impervious coverage, and I think it's important to break that up and have more green and pervious areas. But I will say that so I think that through the DEP's new requirement, green infrastructure is going to become a lot more common in our communities. We're going to see a lot more developments having to put it, but it really only applies to larger scale developments. It's above a certain threshold. And so, I'd love for some of our communities to adopt requirements for green infrastructure for lower thresholds for smaller developments, and keeping in mind, balancing costs for smaller property developments. And there are some options for, smaller scale and less expensive green infrastructure that can still have an impact.
Great. Unless we have any more comments here, and feel free to let them trickle in after. We will go to scenario 2. Okay, so in scenario 1, we were talking more about individual actions and initiatives that can be taken. Scenario 2 fully transforms that to be about partnerships that can be formed and the potential expanded impact that can have. So, for example, at the parks along the bay, the coastal protections are made more robust. Instead of just protecting the individual fields and services and buildings within them, we would propose protecting the park as a whole, raising the edge, doing a raised walkway, flood wall, etc., to fully reduce the potential impacts of major storms and also lessen the bounce back time after disasters. This also starts to include the Stephen R. Gregg Park to the north, which is a county park. And within scenario 2, it's not all just public-private partnerships that we would look to foster to create these projects. It's also partnerships at different levels of government, across agencies that don't always have the best communication. Overall, this scenario is about working together. So we also see that the green infrastructure streets get expanded throughout the city with a larger green infrastructure program. We see that with public-private partnerships in general, the funding sources are increased, the potential footprint is increased as we open up potential space on private properties. But also there are things like adopt a green street programs, adopt a park, all of these other things that we begin to open up in scenario 2. You will also see with these orange arrows here, those are potential spaces where we would propose resilience hubs, one of which does happen to be at the high school. So that was a great suggestion. And overall, to the eastern side, where we have the light rail corridor, where we saw a lot of flooding in our maps, partnering with NJ Transit and the light rail, and also to a certain extent along 440 NJ DOT, to create a more robust corridor there to increase conveyance so that it doesn't impact the light rail or the highway as much, and to bring it out to the south in the Constable Hook area with an increased pumping station.
We just take a moment to pause and switch interpreters.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
So what would some of this look like in the area? So we see things like this elevated boardwalk at number 1, that not only would be a walkway to connect the area, but also could have native grasses and be aesthetically pleasing overall. In number 2, we see something more like inland road raising, which is less in our area, more in the Constable Hook side of the study area line, but it would protect some of the areas within central Bayonne as there is inundation that comes through Constable Hook. If we look at the potential drainage improvements, we can see in number 3 an example of how a retention area in a park can be fully integrated into the park, can again be aesthetic with walkways, etc., but overall has the impact of removing that water from the combined system, not overwhelming the current systems, and then slowly releasing that back into the waterways. Number 4, we see some ideas for increasing the conveyance and drainage along railway corridors, again, relatively important in our area along the light rail, and through partnerships that could be possible, partially because we're working towards the same goal. The city and NJ Transit both want to reduce flooding in that area. Pooling funds and resources will make that all more possible. And then lastly, in green infrastructure, we see at number 5, something more like a public-private pocket park, which can begin to open up spaces that were previously closed off through these partnerships, having more green and park space throughout the city, but also fully integrating green infrastructure into those, retention, permeable spaces, rain gardens, etc. And at number 6, one of the main things that comes out in scenario 2 that is not in the others is a green and blue roof program through these partnerships. So we know that there are a lot of industrial roofs in Bayonne. They, again, may be a bit more in the other Breakout and Constable Hook, but we do have some larger scale roofs in Western Bayonne where we can integrate these and green roofs, which again hold that water that would normally be runoff that goes into the system and contributes to overwhelming the system, can be held until the event passes and then slowly released back into the system. So what are some considerations for scenario 2? So in protecting the full parks, we obviously see an increase in permitting costs, etc., but the level of protection goes up as well. However, even with this investment, we're not providing comprehensive coastal protections. There are still some gaps in between parks. There are some areas where the elevation is relied on more than interventions. So how do we, in that case, provide comprehensive coastal protections? For the expanded stormwater and drainage improvements, we see the potential to create new outfalls, to create new retention spaces, but these may significantly affect the existing uses in the rights of way along roads and potentially in some of the uses for the parks. Lastly, for green infrastructure, we can see a greater expansion and pervasiveness of these green infrastructure projects onto these private as well as public sites. However, once we reach a certain level of green infrastructure projects, it becomes a maintenance and an inspection burden in essence. All of these spaces need to be in working function. They need to have inspections to open, etc. So with a greater number, a greater burden. And Mary?
Thanks, Craig. So in this scenario on the non-physical and policy solutions, really things that rely more on partnerships between the municipality, the city of Bayonne, and nonprofit organizations, as well as partnerships with private property owners. So for one example, the Flood Management 101 campaign could include more partnership with schools and community groups, engaging them in that campaign in terms of, so that people are hearing from, maybe groups that they already know when they're hearing about flood risk and different resiliency strategies. Also includes, incorporating resiliency into redevelopment plans, as well as other ways of incentivizing green infrastructure on private properties. This could be through, flood overlay zone, things that would require the construction of green infrastructure when properties are being redeveloped. Those are some of the main ideas. So again, if there's any new thoughts on specific properties or specific projects, as well as ideas on where a resilience hub should be located, more broadly, anything that out of what Greg walked through or what I walked through, what are things that you really like? What are things that maybe dislike or have some additional questions about?
Also, what are some of the differences between scenario 1 and 2 that you find better or worse? For example, protecting the whole park versus just the park assets. And feel free to either raise your hand or add to the chat.
Just want to chime in here that we know it's a lot of content, and we're covering a lot of things. And so as soon as we can, we're going to have these materials uploaded to our website so you can take a look and hopefully provide us with additional feedback. And at the end of the session, I'll drop a link in. Actually, I could drop it in now so that you can provide more detailed feedback and take another look at the materials.
Kevin, does your cat have any preferences?
I think she wanted to not be involved in the meeting anymore.
Yeah.
All right. Well, if there's nothing else here, we can move on to scenario 3. Okay. So in scenario,
were you going to say something?
Oh, sorry.
Kieran, were you going to say something that looked? Can't actually hear you.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was having a little connection issues with my my headset there. Sorry. You know, we were talking about greening projects, and I was wondering. I know in Jersey City and in New York, they had tree censuses, right, where they counted the trees that were in the community. And in Bayonne, I've over the past I'd say 10 years, I mean, I've seen big trees just disappearing. You know, and they're replaced with these little like sticks that maybe last. You know, they don't grow more than like 15 feet, and it's really changed a lot of the scenery in the streets. But it also has it also limits how much water that can be held in the ground, right? Because these things, you know, big trees have a benefit. They have a value to the city. So, is there any, you know, I mean, would having a tree census done in Bayonne also help, you know, with sort of guide some of this stuff? Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, within some of the things that we're looking at, particularly for the expanded risk context, where there are tree canopy maps and tree canopy studies of the region that we will be delving a bit deeper into to both see areas of need, but also to mitigate heat island effect. So that is where we are going to look at that.
Let's talk a little bit about this briefly. First, Kieran, though, I have a question. Are there any particular neighborhoods that you noticed that some of the larger trees are being lost more than others?
Well, right in front of my house, well, my neighbor took down a tree. You know, it was like 50 feet tall, I guess, and there was a huge tree that was in someone's yard a few blocks away. And I mean, I love this tree, you know, and to see it disappear was just such it was like a sad thing, you know. But
Yeah.
just riding through the streets, I've noticed like, you know, like something's different about this block, and then I realize, oh, that tree is gone, you know. And then if they are replaced, because usually they're not even replaced, there's just a little bush there or some small thing that doesn't really, you know, can't take the place of what was there, you know.
Right. Yeah. It's very interesting. It's amazing, like, you know, even just visually, like what an impact a tree can have on the community. I will say, you know, it is a challenge. The fact is that, you know, trees get old and you know, have to be removed before they, you know, have any, you know, negative, you know, consequences. But we do recognize, you know, that a mature tree can, you know, absorb a lot more stormwater, provide a lot more shade, you know, than, you know, a brand new tree that was planted. Of course, you know, every tree that is removed, you know, should definitely be replaced. Of course, you can't really replace it with another, you know, huge 100-year-old tree. So it takes a long time to, you know, replace a tree that's lost. Something that I will say I've seen being done in some areas is they have requirements to try to make up the difference a little bit. For example, if, you know, a tree of a certain diameter is removed, then it has to be replaced with 2 trees or 3 trees, and, you know, to help replace, a little bit as fast as you can. And let's say in general that a tree census is a great way to find out a bit more about a community's tree species and the conditions of the trees and also the benefits that it's providing to the community. That's a pretty long-term project, but something that we can do in more of a shorter term is that there's ways to use sort of like visual imagery to estimate tree canopy. Of course, that's not as accurate, but it does give you at least, a general picture of, the overall tree coverage and some areas. It can help to identify some areas that might be lacking that can be a priority for future plantings.
Great. Now, in the interest of time, we will move on to scenario 3. If you have anything else for scenario 1 or 2, we will have another pause at the end to discuss. So in scenario 3, you can see that this map has become a lot more populated. That's partially because scenario 3 is about being holistic. It's about coordination, and not only coordination on larger, more regional projects that could come out of a regional entity, but coordination on the interconnectivity of people, ecologies, and economies that we already see in the region. So as you can see, as one of the main examples, on the west coast along Newark Bay, scenario 3 proposes a continuous barrier that runs along the whole entire coast. This is more or less feasible in some areas, particularly in between the parks where there's not already walkways or open land. But we see this as fully tying into the planned Hackensack River Greenway, which again runs up along this whole entire coast. We see that as one of the main dig opportunities, which is a phrase that we love. If we can dig once and get multiple co-benefits out of one area, one project, then that is more beneficial for the agencies involved, the end users, the environment, etc. So along this Hackensack River Greenway, we would propose more intensive green infrastructure projects, some more surface green infrastructure projects, but also integrating it with that coastal barrier and raising the edge where we would already be putting in a walkway. Another one of the main actions that occurs here only in scenario 3 is the introduction of some deep tunnel projects for drainage. So where the other scenarios are working mostly within the current system and within current paradigms of sewer separation, etc., these deep tunnels introduce a new element that essentially can hold large amounts of water, larger than the retention, the distributed retention tanks, larger than the current system, can hold it underwater in a large tunnel. You'll see a picture example on the next slide, and then slowly release that back into the system after the event has passed. This gets stormwater out of the combined system and also helps the rest of the city begin to drain and bounce back faster. You can also see here, we would have a slightly wider distribution of these green infrastructure corridors and therefore green infrastructure projects. But overall, looking at how Bayonne connects not only across itself, but connects north to Jersey City across these greenways, connects to Newark. This Hackensack River Greenway corridor intersects both the Morris Canal Greenway, the planned Morris Canal Greenway, and Essex Hudson Greenways a bit farther to the north. So really just greening this whole entire region, interconnecting everything. And also in scenario 3, looking at opportunities for wetland restoration, particularly at sewer sewer outfalls and these newer dedicated stormwater outfalls, because it will help filter the water before it gets into the regional waterways, which affects everyone.
We just pause to switch interpreters. It is loading. It is not letting me do it.
Oh no.
Okay, I'll play with it and let you know when I'm ready.
Okay, should I continue?
Yes.
Okay. So here on the key changes slide for scenario 3, we are looking at mostly images of how each of these categories can be integrated with greenways, walkways, etc., things that are already planned. And then at number 4, you can see that image that I was talking about for a deep tunnel project. You can see the potential impact of being able to hold that much water underground and overall remove that from flooding homes, businesses, etc., throughout the city. In the coastal protections row on the top, you can see some examples from the larger region, mostly New York City, of some riverfront walkways that are integrated with both protections, green infrastructure, and potentially living shorelines. One of the larger projects that we would look at in scenario 3, outside of the outside of the region, is the Newark Bay Living Shorelines project, which would be a coordination between Bayonne, Jersey City, Newark, potentially going farther north into the Meadowlands. So something like that is much more feasible within scenario 3.
Okay, one of our interpreters had dropped out of the meeting and now she's back. So I'm going to go ahead and switch now.
Okay.
Okay, we should be good, thanks.
Cool. All right, so some of the considerations here. So obviously we get a much more comprehensive full protection at the border of Bayonne, at the coastal areas where we would erect these continuous barriers. However, as you can see in the consideration sliders, that gets much higher on the cost, permitting, constructability side, however, has the greatest level of protection. So the main trade-off there is some of the costs, some of the time involved, permitting, construction, etc. In the drainage improvements, we also take a more intensive approach, particularly with these deep tunnel projects. They can be managed more effectively with the current topography of the city. They are relatively feasible. However, they do get a bit more expensive, are harder to construct, and overall present greater potential issues for implementation. And then lastly, on green infrastructure, we're looking at tying into all of these greenways, promoting dig once, etc. This actually helps us with permitting and costs if we are digging once and latching on essentially to a project that is already going. However, it may require some conversion of existing uses. For example, some areas of parks that would be turned into wetland areas, some of the more right-of-way or more recreational greenway areas may have some limitations due to stormwater management, etc. Mary?
Thanks, Greg. So on the non-physical side, scenario 3 is really about creating kind of the regional governance structures and systems that are really necessary to achieve the types of solutions that Greg was walking through. So, really trying to continue to, build off the Resilient NENJ program to really create ongoing coordination structures at that regional scale that allow all the municipalities to together advocate for the funding at the scale that is really necessary to achieve these strategies, as well as being able to coordinate across municipalities, across jurisdictions, and with all the other agencies that are involved at multiple scales to really make these larger sets of improvements really possible. So that's kind of the big theme here. And so, that could mean, having regional champions and training programs, a regional program around composting and waste reduction, regional tree planting program, just really everything that we thought about at the smaller scale, doing that, more of it and at a larger scale. This is our last scenario. So I think it'd be great to hear about what people think of these scenarios, but also maybe I think a question for this group. I know that there's a few of you that have been involved with some of our earlier public outreach meetings too, and I'm curious, what were you maybe hoping to see in terms of strategies and representation of different tools that you're not seeing here, or are there things that you were really hoping to see and you are seeing here, and so that's great. Do you think that we have kind of the right mix of solutions across these three scenarios? Yeah, Ahmed.
Go. Hi, it's Dan here, Dan Smurda. There are so many good ideas here. And as much as I love green infrastructure, we live in Bayonne and we have a very long yard. We're down by the bay. And we've done everything we could between paving the backyard so it takes the water. Yeah, pavers, I'm sorry, pavers. We have about 5, 6 evergreen trees. They're about 20, 30 feet tall back there. We have a nice tree out in the front of our house. But all of our neighbors, although they love green infrastructure in the city, they're not going to put a tree up in front of their house. They're taking away their lawns. They want to do, the green strip, even in the backyard. The backyards are just concrete. It's going to be hard to convince. If you're going to take a survey, I don't know how we're going to promote this, but if you were to ask the people for an opinion, you're going to get 1,000 opinions. But I'll tell you, they're not going to want to pick up leaves off the curb, or they don't like my tree in the front of the house because the leaves come down in front of their house, even though I'll try to pick them up. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm just saying these might be some of the things we're going to be up against. And I do think that green infrastructure is important, but big things like Fitzpatrick Park, I think whatever's going to be the big solution to take care of the water in general, I think that's the thing that we should do. But I don't know who's going to be responsible to okay the bill. I don't know how much it's going to cost. I think they're great ideas. I would say go for the thing that promotes draining most of the water, capturing most of the water, and we can build on top of that with green infrastructure as we go. But take care of what's going to happen. If we get another Sandy come through, we're going to have a lot of problems, so go for what's going to most of the water first, and then build on top of that, as we go along.
Yeah, a lot of people don't want to maintain that clean patches of grass in front of their house,
Oh, I'm having trouble hearing you, Alicia.
Oh, that's rare. Usually I'm too loud.
That's better.
A lot of people don't want to maintain that patch of grass in front of their house because, you're picking up dog waste. You got to mow it down. There's weeds that grow. There's a lot of problems with that. So they're taking it out. But that does help a lot with absorbing a lot of the water when it rains. I'm not talking about a huge storm. I'm just talking about a normal rainstorm, The street that I grew up on, it was like Karen was talking before about the trees. I mean, we had a beautiful tree-lined street. And it just, after a while, they were old, these big old trees, and they're a hazard for the power lines, especially now that we're getting more and more powerful storms, you know, it becomes a hazard, you know. So I can kind of understand that. I'm not crazy about the way they shape the trees like this around the power lines. That looks ridiculous. So you really don't have much of a choice. You have to get rid of them. But the question is, what do you replace it with?
Yeah.
A lot of people just paved over and took everything out. And what happens? Our intersection now floods like crazy every time it rains.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
And the larger trees, I've noticed, I can pick out one example on Broadway between 5th and 4th and 5th Street, I think it is, Trinity Church on Broadway. There are beautiful large trees there. But what we've noticed is that as sidewalks become undone because of the roots, not Trinity Church, but you know, people who have big trees like that, they want to put down a new concrete walk. The city needs to repave the broken things in the curb out. And what happens is all because of these large trees that have been there for 80 years, which are beautiful, but the roots are large and the roots are big. And then what is scary is, in order to put down a nice sidewalk, they have to cut the roots, you know? So now, instead of it branching out in all directions to hold this massive tree, now we're cutting off some of its legs, you know?
Mm.
And if you go by, you're going to see a beautiful root system that was chopped from Broadway Street to the curb, and then on the other side of the tree, on the concrete sidewalk. There's only just a little bit coming out this way that's holding this thing up. If we get a big storm, and that, you know, you don't want to see it removed, but it might come down. It might come down in a big storm, and it might take power lines. And so you know, there's so many. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. You know, and the unanswerable question, I guess, I'm posing. What do you do?
Rain gardens and bioswales and stuff. Is there areas in the town where we could make use of those?
Rain gardens and bioswales?
Yeah, you know, like a bigger I know you don't want to get rid of all the trees, but I mean, if there's areas where we can like, construct like a sort of a catch basin thing. Not a catch basin, it's a rain garden, you know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think a lot of those green lines are intended to represent, you know, that kind of concept.
Yeah, we do see a lot of overbuilt streets in this area and a lot of leftover right-of-way spaces that are controlled by the city, and with the right guidance and program, they could definitely start putting those in.
Yeah. I have one comment. Throughout the whole project, I've found it difficult. I mean, you've done wonderful, wonderful work with these maps, but you can't read them. They're so tiny. And it's all the little keys. Maybe it's us, maybe, but it's hard really to get the benefit of what's on these great maps here. If you can maybe, when you have them.
Yeah, no, that's helpful feedback. Yeah.
Blow them up or something for us, you know, challenge people.
Yeah. And we will be, you know, providing, you know, after the meeting, copies of these too, so you can, like, you know, get them and zoom in.
Perfect.
To help that.
Perfect.
But that's good feedback. We can try to make it clear.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Ahmed, did you have something as well?
Oh yeah, it's actually kind of, I mean, relatively similar to what they just said, and in the sense that maybe like moving forward, if it's possible to kind of show how certain scenarios and certain like initiatives affect certain people. So the same way they just said, like the green infrastructure, as great as it is, might not be efficient for certain people because they barely take care of their greens as it is. So maybe if we can kind of show how scenario 1 or scenario 2, scenario 3, et cetera, affects certain people, that way the people generally can look at it and say, okay, well, I own a house or I own a business. How does this scenario affect me? How does this scenario affect me? And that way they can kind of see like, okay, well, this one is best for me, but might be a detriment for my neighbor and vice versa. So it'll kind of let people gauge like which scenarios are most efficient on a broader scale, and it'll be easier for them to imagine like the practical implementation because they can put themselves in the position of, okay, well, I fit this criteria, and so which scenario benefits me as I fit in this criteria, if that makes sense.
I also think it has to
Makes a
do
lot of sense.
a little bit more. We need to maybe do more outreach. Maybe the city can get involved in educating homeowners on what they can do on their level, you know, to help. Because I don't think a lot of people are even aware. You know, they take the tree out and pave over. They don't even know what they're doing. And then they complain that there's a flood. Well, you know, I really think there's more, it has to be done with awareness.
We try with the water guardians to promote that, you know, let them know what that strip was along the curb. But it's hard to reach a lot of people.
Yeah.
You know, it's hard to reach a lot of people. Maybe with the influence of a city hall department or something, might be able to reach more people than what we could do. You know, I don't know. But maybe the more people know.
I think you're doing a great job, and keep up the good work. And that's part of this the point of this project is that we all wanna work together to, you know, help get the word out and educate as we can.
And I get you a rain barrel.
Ahmed, you had your hand up again?
Yeah, I just had pretty much like one last thing to say, but it was also in regards to, again, what they just said. I found it not necessarily difficult, but oh no, I guess difficult is the best word, to kind of find people that would be interested in joining the meeting up until there was a flooding. Like I've given out the flyer so many times, and then they'll say, yeah, you know, this is interesting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then once it actually floods and they what's it called, endure the flooding, then they start to say, oh, you know, how come there's flooding, yada yada yada, when they could have, you know, joined in on this and, you know, kind of given their thought. But that actually made me think maybe we should find a way to kind of advertise personally, not like individually, but like I said, if you're a business owner, how could joining a room like this or a meeting like this benefit you? You know, how could you as a business owner or a homeowner or, you know, just a person that is around these areas, what would be the benefit of joining this, and pretty much like what I guess, yeah, just what would be the benefit of joining something like this, and what can you learn from it, and why you should join it? Because I've noticed on the flyers, of course, the flyers are, of course, they're general, they have to be flyers, but if we can find specific flyers for specific people, that way you can give one to a business owner, one to a homeowner, one to, like, they're tailored specifically for that person. I think that could be beneficial because it'll kind of give them like a personal reason to join, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love it. Let's talk further and strategize on that.
Agreed.
Go ahead.
That's a good idea.
Just like one to Ahmed's point too. Yeah, trying to educate more people, and like you said, you know, until there is a flood, that's when they get concerned. You know, you're right. But you can talk. I can talk to people up and down the street, like Ahmed said. You know, and it's, how do we influence them? How do we get their attention? Somebody's working on it. Somebody's got this covered. You know, it's not my. You know, they'll turn it. Don't worry, somebody else is working on this, and they don't realize that it's just as important for them. And I don't know how to convince people that, you know.
Well, until they go on social media and everybody's blowing up. You know, let somebody mention flooding and you get a whole bunch of people, you know, and this city's not doing anything and blah, blah, blah. And then I get started because that makes me angry because I realize everything that's being done, but it takes time. But, you know, nobody wants to get involved. I mean, you send emails, you attend Earth Day events, the hometown fair, I get, you know, names, I'm giving away rain barrels. Nobody, who's here? Nobody. I mean, you know, it's kind of disheartening because nobody wants to get involved. And then until there's a disaster, then everybody's got a big mouth. So that's
Well, That'll be something we'll try to work on.
Mhm.
We can mute.
Yeah. Well, making appeals, as Ahmed was saying, to like exactly what they could get out of it, and how that may be different for different audiences. That's a really good point. Something we can think about more. Well, I think we have a few last questions just about if there's anything more in terms of like priorities out of all of this that we should make sure to advance, or if there's anything that we talked about or that we touched on in our discussion that you want to make sure doesn't happen. That'll be helpful to us as we go on with our next steps here.
And while folks are thinking, I'll just switch the interpreters one last time. Okay, we should be good. Thank you.
Megan, you want to drop the survey link again?
Yes. So we have two surveys. One is just about this meeting. If you just want to let us know what you thought of the meeting, how things were presented. And then we have another one where you can give more specific feedback about the solutions. And I'll drop that one in. And we'd also love to hear from you on our just the presentation of the solutions, if things were easy to understand, if you feel like you need additional context, and then also the questions that are up on the screen, like what do you think is most important? What do you not want to see? So thank you.
So I guess I'll jump in and say, I think yesterday the UN announced, I was listening to it on the radio, that humanity has like 3 years to cut emissions by 50%, or we will have irreversible climate change, right? And I think we got a better chance of World War III happening than that happening, unfortunately, right? And but we got a lot of challenges ahead of us, and even I really have a big distrust, and I despise Suez and Veolia. I think I mentioned that at the last meeting I was at, and they combine now. They're the biggest water corporation in the world, and my uncle worked for the municipal for the town for the water department when it was owned by Bayonne. When it was sold to Suez, or United Water first, which was then Suez, he worked in the sewers for United Water, and they basically stopped doing. They did a fraction of the maintenance on the sewer systems as they did when it was owned by Bayonne. So holding these people accountable when they're not doing their jobs they're supposed to do, when they're just worried about collecting, making their money on the water supply side and neglecting the sewer side, they should be held accountable if and when they do that. So it's one thing I would want to see happen is, like, because somebody said at the last meeting that these green infrastructure jobs are great, but they cost money to maintain. And the will is there to get them done and built, but it's not always, the funding isn't always there to maintain them after the fact, so they get neglected, and it's a sad thing, but that's what happens too. So, but I'd just like to thank you guys. It's a great presentation again, and it's inspiring to be here, so thanks.
Thanks for joining. And yeah, I think like that's, pointing out those sort of issues with the, existing utilities, I think is really important to, as we think about recommendations around like governance and like what sort of scales these different responsibilities should lie. I think that's definitely something to think through.